Hello, welcome back to the West London Sport YouTube channel. I'm delighted to be joined today by my West London Sport colleague Ben Kosky to chat about his new book, Are You Rangers in Disguise? Ben, how have you found the experience of writing the book?
I've got to say, Dan, it was really enjoyable. It's something I found to do basically to keep me occupied during the lockdown earlier in the year. Like a lot of people, I didn't have all of a sudden my diary was quite blank, and it seemed a good way to organise the time, really. But yeah, it was great actually, just looking back through old newspaper cuttings, of which I've got several, and I suppose just trying to get my thoughts together about that period in QPR history, because it was a very eventful time when I was reporting on the club for local media or local newspapers at the time. And yeah, it was really a very interesting experience, I think, just recalling some of the stuff that was going on, some of the characters, and I suppose how my feelings about the club changed through that close involvement with them, which I think is something, that all of us who work in media probably do experience, but I think particularly when it's the club that you support as well, it can certainly affect how you view things as time goes on.
Yeah, you mentioned it was eventful. Obviously, all football clubs will have their ups and downs over time, but I mean, for QPR, especially in the last, say, 20 years, it's probably been a bit more extreme ups and downs than most clubs will have experienced and most fans will have experienced.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, I should explain the reason for the title of the book, really. Are You Rangers in Disguise? Was something that seemed to fit perfectly, because it got to a point for me where I felt this is a club I don't really recognise anymore, because it changed so dramatically over the course of a few years. And I think really I'd grown up supporting a club, or the club, for various reasons, and none of those I think seem to apply anymore at one point. You had a club that previously had been, I think, all about community, the area, developing youth, developing players from lower divisions, and some sort of loyalty to the long-serving backroom staff as well. And I think it's really true to say that certainly under Briatore and Eccleston, all that went out of the window, and suddenly we saw this attempt to position a mid-table Championship football club as a global brand, a project, all this sort of strange terminology, and I think I was very baffled by it. I think probably a lot of other fans were at the time as well.
Yeah, and obviously there was a lot of managers coming and going during that time. As I was saying to you, obviously before we started the recording, I've read sort of half the book, and it's very entertaining hearing some of the stories about the managers that you've had to deal with. Obviously, Mr. Gregory was one that sort of was quite entertaining for me. Your story about having to get there early to the training ground at 8:30 and then having to wait till 9:45 for him to come out because he liked his sort of games with the media. I mean, there's some great stories that you've got in the book from various managers over the time of your time of covering QPR.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, John Gregory really was, a very interesting character to deal with, for one. I mean, as you say, you got it exactly right when you talk about playing little games. I mean, that's pretty much what it was like with, certainly with him. And it was, I think, just quite a shock at the time, that you'd go to a match, the team had won or lost. It didn't really make any difference, and he just wouldn't turn up to talk to anyone if you didn't fancy it. And as you say, the early morning at the training ground was a classic example, because yeah, he said to me, if I like to get in early, so if you want to talk to me, get there early, which I did, and then I'd be sitting around for about an hour and a half or something. But I think what I found was if you could put that to one side, if you could be bothered basically to be messed around and all the rest of it, then he was actually very interesting to talk to, and he'd have some very some interesting things to say about football, about the club, and so on. And so he certainly wasn't dull. I mean, I would say that there was worse that came after John Gregory, to be fair. If you're looking at the managers that I was dealing with at that time, I would say broadly it started off as good as it could possibly be for me with Ian Holloway. It was an absolute dream.
Legend.
No question about it. I mean, he was just very good fun to deal with. And some of the as I think I've written, some of the analogies he come out with were just quite incredible, and I didn't really understand them, but they were funny anyway. And I think it gradually went downwards, really, not so much because of the characters involved, but more because of the way the club changed. I think post John Gregory, suddenly it was very hard to have any sort of relationship with the manager of the club, or the coach, or whatever they were calling him at the time, because I think they just felt this wasn't really a part of how they wanted to do things. So for me, there was a long succession of people who became manager or coach, or whatever the title was, who you just didn't really see all that often, and you didn't get to speak to very often. So that posed a challenge as well. And then we come through to Neil Warnock, which I suppose you would say was a return to the old school style of manager. But I have to say, personally, I found Neil Warnock very, very hard to deal with. And I think that's one reason why I didn't personally enjoy QPR's promotion season in 2011 as much as perhaps most people did, because from a professional point of view, it was just a very hard season to cover, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously Ian Holloway as being one of the sort of favourite managers you had to deal with. Was there any others that you really enjoyed, or were especially good with the media, good for getting stories and for getting quotes as well?
I mean, I have to give a mention to Gary Warnock there, who took over from Ian Holloway, and Gary I always found great to deal with, because he's always totally upfront. He might not have been the most quotable guy, but for me that didn't really matter. For me, it's more a case of, is he prepared to talk to you and explain what's going on? And Gary always was, and so he was, for me, certainly up there in terms of managers to deal with. In the later era, as I've said in my book, I was a big fan of Ian Dowie as well. I just felt Ian Dowie was incredibly intelligent as a manager, I suppose, which isn't meant to sound insulting to some of the other managers. I just felt he really had his head screwed on. I liked what he was doing with the team, and I certainly believe if he'd been given longer, he would have got the team into at least a playoff position. I'd also probably say, it's only I suppose a year later or thereabouts, Jim Magilton for me was someone was perfectly good to deal with, except that by then it wasn't easy to actually get to talk to him, because things were much more tightly run at that point. The whole media operation, I suppose, had become very, very different to what it was at the outset. I mean, at the outset, I think the setup was really, you got on with it yourself. You had one-to-one conversations with the manager over the phone, basically whenever was convenient for them, and no one would by and large interfere. And then we saw that kind of setup really, really changing, and I suppose gradually we've got to the situation where things are at now with most football clubs, where everything is very stage managed, as you know yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you mentioned about the club obviously getting tighter with the media, and I suppose part of that that comes into it is obviously the sort of owners and people that run the club as well, sort of having their say. And you definitely had to deal with not just obviously managers, but a lot of different sort of board members and people running the club, owners during the time as well, with a lot of changes in the boardroom going on.
Yeah, absolutely right, Dan. I mean, I think the biggest change, of course, was an incident that a lot of people will be familiar with when we ended up with Gianni Palladini taking sole control on the board, and Bill Power, Mark Devlin leaving the club. I mean, I certainly remember at that time I'd got to know Bill Power, certainly, and again found him very good to deal with. And all of a sudden he was out, and literally I think it was actually Mark Devlin's phone. You'd ring Mark Devlin's phone, and Gianni would pick it up suddenly, and he just said, "We don't need a chief executive. I can do it." So that was his view anyway. And yeah, and of course Gianni was also an interesting character to deal with. I mean, as I've said in my book, I think he's probably one of the least discreet individuals I've ever met, and you know, information was readily available on things, to be honest.
Yeah, the story obviously about when you went into the office and he got the list of players with all their wages on. You couldn't imagine something like that happening at a professional club nowadays, could you? Really? It was
no
surprising.
Well, not at all. I mean, for a start, you wouldn't get invited to go and see the chairman or the guy in charge anyway. You certainly wouldn't get shown that kind of information. I mean, it was really, it was quite mind-boggling. I mean, I think for me, one of the most incredible things was to see there was one player on the staff who was getting paid less than I was, which, as you know yourself, regional journalists do not earn a lot of money, so that was quite a surprise. That sort of information, I think, was, if you like, readily available, which was quite incredible. I think it was entertaining, but obviously then it came to a point where Gianni's role changed, and suddenly he wasn't quite available or open, because, as he said to me, well, other people are running the club now, and unfortunately those other people, I think, were very unsuitable people to be running the club or to run any football club. We've seen this so many times with English football, with people in charge who really shouldn't be. You've got to ask what is the due diligence procedure with some of the people that take over. And I think the biggest problem with Briatore and Eccleston was that they never really got. I think that football is not like other businesses, and you can't approach it in the same way as you would another business, where you'd say, well, this is how we run things and this is our product, and if you don't like it, you're a customer, you can go somewhere else. But football doesn't work like that, does it? You don't go somewhere else, because you want your club to be run the right way. And I think it's a real shame that they really didn't have any interest in taking advice from people who understood Queen's Park Rangers, and didn't see why they should. And as a result, the whole club really just, I think, deteriorated into a complete laughingstock. And I think that probably hurt a lot of fans, actually, that we'd all had certainly people we knew in the past who'd said, oh, I quite like QPR, they're like my second favourite team, or I like Loftus Road, or I like the football, or whatever it was. And all of a sudden people were saying, why QPR so up themselves? I really, I don't get them, and they're just splashing all this money around, and who do they think they are? And you couldn't really disagree with them, because that's exactly what was happening.
There was certainly a sort of big change in the style. Obviously, you mentioned about bringing through young players maybe in the earlier days, and then obviously with the Tony Fernandes sort of regime coming in, and some serious money flying around in the Premier League, it was almost sort of motivated by just trying to stay in. And it's fair to say there were a lot of signings that spring to mind that perhaps weren't worth the sort of money they were paying for him. I mean, what have you made of the whole sort of Fernandes regime? I mean, it certainly seems to have changed a lot more recently, obviously with Mark Warburton coming in, and certainly there's a lot more focus on young players with Eze getting sold to Crystal Palace for 20 million or whatever the fee was certainly like a big success story for the club.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Dan. I mean, I know a lot of fans understandably were disappointed about Eze going to Crystal Palace, but for me, that's a real positive, because it had been so long since a Premier League club wants to pay millions of pounds for one of the players that QPR have developed, and that's a good thing. It shows they're doing some positive things now. I mean, you can't really overestimate, I think, or overstate just how the well completely dried up for, I would say, about 15 years. Again, I grew up in an era where QPR was a big part of it was about developing young talent, local talent, and if they got sold on for big money, well, so be it. Then you go and find the next one. And I think certainly we went through years where there wasn't any consideration given to that at all. And that's no reflection, by the way, on the youth team coaches at the time, the people like Joe Gallen and Steve Gallen, and Mark Bircham, because they weren't given, I think, that the facilities and the tools, if you like, to work with to develop top players. They did the very best they could, but definitely there was an idea that we don't need to develop players because we'll just buy them ready-made. And that, I suppose, brings me on to what you asked about since Tony Fernandes took over, which is now getting on for 10 years, actually. And I mean, my feeling about it has always been that Tony Fernandes' intentions are broadly good, but the naivety that he showed, certainly in the early years, was really quite staggering. I would say those seasons, those three seasons in the Premier League in the first half of the last decade, largely they were wasted because it was a continuation of the same policy, just with bigger money being thrown around, I suppose. I mean, just about all the players that came in that time, they were all either players on their way down or making a sideways move. And again, the template, in my view, for QPR signings, which is what we're seeing now, is someone who's either come through the youth team or they've come from a lower division and they're looking for that step up. They're hungry. They want to, they want to progress, and QPR is the platform for them to do it. And as you said, we are now seeing more of that happen. I think it's partly financial necessity because of financial fair play, but it's very welcome nonetheless. And I think the idea that they're building towards a long-term team or squad, that's got to be better than what was happening in the sort of years I've been talking about, which was let's build a squad for the next 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned obviously about some of the players there. I mean, you've obviously been able to deal with a lot of different QPR squads and players over the years that you've been covering the team. And, we touched on it a little bit there with obviously the kind of media landscapes and sort of, I guess, access to players sort of changing over time. But you certainly managed to, strike up a bond with quite a few players, the likes of Gareth Ainsworth, who you talk about in your book, who wrote a column for the, papers that you were working for at the time. And certainly you've been able to get a good relationship with a lot of players over the years.
Yeah, I think part of that was, again, just due to how the club was at that time. There was just I suppose it's a bit cliche, but there was more of a feeling of togetherness, I think. That players, coaches, fans, backroom staff, I think you felt we're all on the same page. We're all working together. And so it was a lot easier to establish good relations with a lot of the players. And Gareth Ainsworth would be a great example. I mean, I've got to say he was brilliant as a columnist from my point of view. You look for a few. There's a few criteria you look for when you're asking someone to do a column, and one is, are they a good enough player to be in the team most weeks? Secondly, have they got interesting things to say? And thirdly, can you get hold of them when you need to? And Gareth ticked all those boxes. I mean, it was fairly clear he was going to go on into coaching and management. I didn't expect it quite as quickly as it came about when he became caretaker manager at QPR, he was great like that. And there were a number of others. I mean, I would say others who stand out from the time. Obviously, I'm going to mention Kevin Gallen, who contributed the foreword to my book. He's certainly in that category. Mark Bircham, Lee Cook, Marcus Bignett would be one. Danny Shittu would be one, and probably others that I can't think of off the top of my head now. Again, I think the big difference was players tended to stay at QPR for a period of years. And then obviously you get to know someone over a period of years, you can actually establish some sort of working relationship with them. But that's much harder when fast forward to sort of, 5-6 years later, and you've basically got someone like Clint Hill, who's regarded as a QPR legend because he was there for, I think, 5 years, maybe 6 years, which isn't really that long a time. But again, because the shelf life of most players at QPR was a year or thereabouts. So all that turnover obviously made it much harder. But you know what? I think one of the other things that has changed is that what you have now is footballers are much more wary of establishing contacts with the media because they're wary of saying the wrong thing, being misquoted, whatever. And again, I think you find when you talk to footballers from previous generations, they don't perhaps have those inhibitions. They're just happy to chat and trust you not to not to misquote them or anything like that. So yeah, again, something that's changed, I think, massively there.
Yeah, that brings me quite nicely onto my next question, which is obviously a big theme of the book is obviously not only about the history of QPR that since you've been covering them, the last sort of 20 years, and the managers and ownership change and everything else. It's also about the sort of local media or media perspective of covering the club and the sort of challenges and changes that have happened over time. And obviously we've both worked in local news. We've worked for the same titles, even although a little bit apart from each other. So we know about the challenges faced, and certainly there's been considerable changes obviously since you started covering the club to where we're at now with media, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean the landscape has changed dramatically, and I'm going to sound really ancient when I say that when I started out, the online aspect of media coverage was very much secondary. The primary goal, if you like, was filling printed pages once a week or maybe twice a week, depending on what you were doing. But I mean, when I was starting reporting on QPR, I didn't have a laptop. I was scribbling notes in a notepad. That's how antiquated it sounds. Yeah, very, very much. So I think it definitely, though, it did sort of make a difference to the kind of things you were looking to do, and it also meant you had to be, you always had to be mindful about physical space, I suppose. What is going to fill X number of pages? which again is quite different to when you've got, if you like, unlimited space, and of course you can just produce content at the click of a button. So it's very different. I mean, one of the things I've mentioned, which I think probably wouldn't really strike a chord now, is the difficulty of when you've got primarily a print operation, is print deadlines.
Yeah.
That could be a real problem, especially because when I started out, the papers came out on a Wednesday, which meant the print deadline was on Tuesday. Now, sometimes, of course, you've got a match on a Tuesday night, so that poses a challenge. You've got to be trying to write something that will look fresh on the Wednesday, but isn't affected by the game the night before. So, of course, the absolute nightmare is you've done a big feature with a player who then does the cruciate ligament on Tuesday night, and suddenly, it all looks very past its sell-by date. So there's lots of things that can change there. But but one of the things I think that also I noticed changed was the role of club press officers. Because at the outset, I had a very good relationship with the guy who was at QPR when I started out, and and he understood the logistics. So he would make sure that we had information about a player signing that afternoon or something like that, that we wouldn't look out of date. But then there's a certain amount of trust involved there, because you're saying I'm trusting you with this information, but I don't want to see you publicising it on your Twitter account or what have you beforehand. So but I think that could work, it worked if there was trust involved. It's a bit like, I suppose, agreeing with other media about when you're going to put a story out, which we both know is something that happens a lot more nowadays. There's a set time when this can be published or that can be published, But it was a very different, I suppose, mentality in a way. And I think maybe one of the other aspects that has changed is that now players obviously have got their own social media accounts, so a lot of them they'll communicate directly with fans through Twitter, Instagram, whatever it be. And I think, again, take it back, say 15 years, probably a local newspaper had more of a role to play there, because that was a good way of communicating with fans. They could pick it up and read something that hopefully they wouldn't have seen somewhere else. Media landscape has changed massively, and I'm not going to say whether it's for the better or the worse. It's we've all got opinions on that. It's just different.
Yeah, certainly. It has changed considerably, obviously, since you started. And one of the things that was kind of striking to me was how much sort of more power and, I guess, influence that the local press had, obviously, a few years ago when you started, up until not that long ago. And obviously the whole internet and social media has sort of changed everything. And as well, obviously you spoke in the book about doing the in-house commentary for QPR, and you would sort of pair that with your responsibilities for the local newspaper. And obviously you could sort of wait to publish, obviously, a report when it needed to go in the newspaper. Obviously, with how things are nowadays, it's all instant, isn't it? Everything is up straight away. Quotes go up on Twitter immediately. Reports are online within sort of 10 minutes of the game finishing. So it's certainly, I'd say, more challenging maybe. And obviously you probably wouldn't be able to pair your sort of commentary duties with the local paper stuff if you were doing it sort of nowadays. That's how much it's changed.
Yeah, I think that would be absolutely impossible. I really can't see how that could work. I mean, as you say, at the time it was perfectly possible, and I really enjoyed doing the in-house commentary. It was great. I mean, apart from the fact that the stand which you'll know. Sorry, not the stand, the gantry on the Ellerslie Road side at QPR could be a little bit rickety when when the gale was blowing or what have you. But yeah, it was great because you got all the atmosphere around you of the fans. You could literally sort of feel the vibrations from people jumping up and down, and yeah, it was great fun to do. But as you say, yeah, it wouldn't be possible to do any of that now. Yeah, and again, it's an example of how things have changed. But I think the biggest change, I would say, in media relationship now with football club is that everything now, or pretty much everything, I think is stage managed. I mean, this certainly, I think, is something that Briatore and Eccleston era really ushered in at QPR. All of a sudden, there were all these sort of swanky press conferences happening at bizarre locations, and I mean, we hadn't seen anything like that before. You wanted to talk to someone, you just got their phone number.
Yeah.
And this really all changed. I mean, I think the most bizarre one that I can remember was when Briatore put on a press conference with, I think he had the Gulf Air stewardesses in attendance and all this sort of thing, and and this was all publicising the signing of Parejo from Real Madrid, who I know has actually gone on to become quite a decent player, but at the time he was a young kid that really had no place at QPR. He wasn't valuable from a footballing point of view. He was purely there for, if you like, not even commercial reasons. I think purely there because Briatore wanted to show off the fact he had a connection with Real Madrid and things like this. And and they had this press conference where all this sort of nonsense terminology about brands and projects and whatever else was thrown about, and meanwhile the manager at the time was sort of skulking at the back of the room, had no real input on it whatsoever. So there was any number of these things, but I think that the point I'm trying to make is that suddenly we moved into an era where everything became formal. There wasn't any such thing now as having a conversation with someone from the football club. It had to be an interview or a press conference, and that's not just QPR. That's the way football has developed. But I think it is a pity because it doesn't encourage much frank discussion or conversation. It's sort of all become, I suppose, theatre rather than traditional journalism, if you like. But that's definitely something I wanted to try and get across, just how things have changed so much in that time, just the presentation and the style. I think I've also mentioned one other occasion where they QPR held a press conference when they appointed Paul Hart as the manager for very briefly. He was only there for, I think, a month, but it was and I wasn't there. I had a dentist appointment, and I'm afraid I felt that was more important than meet Paul Hart.
I think.
Well, it does really, but from what I was told, the whole setup was a complete farce, with sort of people firing questions at him about transfer budget and this sort of thing, and that's really just a waste of everyone's time, because if you'd been following QPR by then, you'd know that the manager had no say over transfers and things like that. It was completely irrelevant. So yeah, that was one I'm quite glad I gave a miss, and I think there was only about 4 people there anyway, from what I was told. So probably didn't miss a great deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is really definitely worth a read. For a QPR fan, or for anyone who sort of is a sports journalist or wanting to get into sports journalism, it is really interesting to see how the landscape has changed. Where can people get the book if they want to read it?
Right, so the book is available from the publishers, JMD Media. That's jmdmedia.co.uk. You can order there. They have a discount up until Christmas as well. The book's also available from Amazon, and I've been told Waterstones as well, which is
Very
nice.
nice.
So yeah, so you can order it those ways, or I do have a website, benkosky.com. You can go to there, and of course there will also, I'm sure, be details on West London Sport, outlining where you can buy it. And yeah, I hope it's something that people enjoy reading, because I certainly enjoyed putting it together. And yeah, now I've got to think about what to do for my next book.